Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all this morning. Just want to welcome our visitors. Marilyn, great to see you as well. This morning, our passage and for our sermon is going to be taken from Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. This will be our scripture for this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, starting in verse 1. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity, but God is the one you must fear. Throughout Scripture, one of the recurring instructions we see to God's people is to be careful of the words we say and to guard ourselves against saying too many words. For example, we read in James that one who does not bridle his tongue, this man's religious is worthless. Or we read Jesus himself teaching that everyone will be judged for even every careless and idle word that they speak. And so if there's something that recurs in Scripture, we tend to want to take a moment and think about it. At least we should. We should take a moment and really consider, what does this mean for me and who I am and where I am before God. Because what we have here is this discussion in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, not only of guarding our words in guarding our whole being. In fact, in chapter 5, verse 1, Solomon writes, guarding our steps as we come into the house of God. Not only do we have this description of guarding our words, but also of listening and taking a moment to listen and to take in information, to pay attention to our surroundings and what it is that we're doing. And listening is an essential aspect of our lives. It affects many areas of our lives. It can affect our job performance. I was a hiring manager at one point, and one thing I paid careful attention to was whether or not people would listen, because it's really hard to train someone when they don't listen to the work that needs to be done. Whether or not we listen can affect our relationships with friends, with family, with spouses. Listening is a big part of our lives, and it affects many areas. And one area we see affected by whether or not we listen here is worship. We have this discussion of going near to God's house and listening, guarding our steps and listening. There are a number of things I think that affect our worship, but out of all the things we want to examine in this passage is what Solomon writes, which is whether or not we're listeners. And by listeners, I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about whether or not you're paying attention to my sermon. I'm talking about listening to God and paying attention to who God is and what God has to say when we come into his presence to worship him and to glorify him. So first, I want us to look at the first three verses here. And I'm going to reread these in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. Solomon begins this passage here by comparing the sacrifice of what he calls fools, the sacrifice of fools with listening. And when he's talking about the sacrifice of fools and foolish sacrifices, what we're talking about are people who just do lip service. Right? People whose hearts aren't actually in it. People who, in this sense, this would be Solomon writing. The temple at this time more than likely would have been finished and up, and they would have been able to offer actual sacrifices. You imagine someone going into the temple and just kind of giving a sacrifice of some kind and just getting it over with and going away. And that's what Solomon is describing here, is a sacrifice of fools. And foolishness here foolishness in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs has a lot of different aspects, but one important aspect here is not understanding the gravity of a situation. That's a characteristic quality of a fool. They don't understand the gravity of their situation. They don't understand how deep they're in it right now. And so they come before the God of the universe and act as if he's nothing. It's a foolish thing to do. And so you have this comparison between offering the sacrifice of fools and listening. Now, I don't know about you, but when I talk to people about worship, if I have to correct them in some way, listening is not often my first thought. I've heard many lessons on worship. I've preached lessons on worship. And often if there's a discussion about things like following the pattern, and there are things like, really understand what we're doing. But Solomon takes, I think, a very unique approach, which is if you're going to correct someone in how they worship, tell them to listen. And that would never have occurred to me, to try to correct someone in this way, to tell them to to listen when they come in and worship. And this comparison then between offering the sacrifice of fools, that is just kind of doing lip service, coming, going quickly, checking it off our list, versus someone who understands what they're doing, someone who's listening, is not just a Jewish thing, but it's also one that happens to many Christians today as well. It can be really tempting to just want to come in, check this off our list, get it done through, and go throughout the rest of our week. But that's not what God asks us to do. In fact, Solomon calls that foolish, because we don't really understand what it is to worship if we're doing that. We don't understand the gravity of our situation, that we are coming before the God of the universe who can make something from nothing. So Solomon begins by comparing listening with offering the sacrifice of fools. And there's an essential part of listening here as we read throughout these verses. You're looking at verses 2 and 3. He says, do be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, you are on earth. Let therefore your words be few. An essential part of listening is quietness and just being quiet. It's really hard to listen when we're not quiet. This is something that I think is really wrong with our culture right now, where everyone has a platform and no one is listening. It is an unhealthy behavior when everyone has a platform and everyone has something to say, instructions to give, but no one is listening. And I think one of the best things we can do right now is just to be people who listen. I think that's what can really set us apart from other people, because people who listen are people who come before God and listen. Listening is a habit we are to cultivate. And this habit comes with quietness. There's an essential part of our lives that needs to happen, which is we need to have a quiet aspect of our lives. Solomon says here in verse 3, "For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words." This word business here in the ESV can be easily translated as task. It's probably better understood as busyness. And this verse here, verse 3, I think is an interesting verse. And I'm going to tell you what I think Solomon is saying here. And I get this from Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, their commentary, which is that just as much busyness produces a dream, so many words produce a fool. Right? You take a moment and think about your own experiences when you're going through life and you have a lot to do. You tend to produce dreams about things you're in the middle of doing. Much busyness produces a dream. And in the same way, many words produce a fool. I think that's what's going on here in verse 3. "For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words." Quietness, therefore, is essential part of us cultivating an ability to listen. But quietness doesn't just happen outwardly. It does happen outwardly. In fact, that's one of the things Solomon talks about. Be not rash with your mouth, verse 2. Being quiet outwardly is a good skill to cultivate. For some people, it's easier to cultivate than for others, but it's an essential part of listening. However, I want you to notice verse 2 as well, because Solomon actually gives us two areas in which to cultivate quietness. One is outwardly, be not rash with your mouth. And then he says, "Nor let your heart be hasty." And here we're talking about the biblical heart. In fact, the New American Standard translates this as impulsive thoughts, because that's what we're talking about in the biblical heart, is our minds, our thoughts, things we think about, where we have desires and where we consider things. So not only does Solomon instruct us in verse 2 to be quiet with our words, but also to be quiet in our thoughts. It's not just an outward quietness, but an inward quietness. And it's really hard, I think, for us to have quiet thoughts or quiet minds when we're just filling up our minds with stuff. Maybe I won't speak for you. I'll speak for me and my own personal experiences. It's really hard for me to turn off my mind when I'm just filling it full of stuff. And when I fill my mind full of stuff, I tend to just be, I just tend to be eating things rather than listening. And so Solomon, I think, really actually gives us an important quality for being listeners when we come in and worship God, which is quietness. Both an outward quietness, guarding our mouths, but also an inward quietness, because outward quietness comes from somewhere. And so he says, let not your heart be hasty, or be not impulsive in your thoughts to utter a word before God. Like I said, I think this is something that our culture is really going to have to deal with at some point or another. That we need to cultivate the ability to listen. We need to be able to be quiet at times. In fact, Blaise Pascal, who is a French mathematician, physicist, theologian, philosopher, once said, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. It really makes you stop and think. I think that's terrifying for many people. To put everything aside, right? You take nothing into a room. You don't take a book, you don't take your phone, you don't take anything into a room, and you just sit there quietly by yourself. I think that's really hard for many people to do, and in fact, a frightening thing for many people to do. But quietness and listening, when we lack these things, can cause many problems. And here, Solomon is specifically concerned with the fact that it causes problems in our worship. That when we don't listen, we're not people who worship very well. There's actually, when you begin to think about this, I think a very profound truth here. That who we are outside of worship is who we are when we worship. And sometimes it's easy to get caught up in thinking that I have my week and I do my thing, but when I come to worship, I can just flip a switch and suddenly I'm worshiping God, and then the switch is off and I go back to my week. And it doesn't work like that. We don't work like that. Our minds don't work like that. Who we are out there is who we are in here. And if we're people who can't listen out there, then how are we supposed to come before God and listen? I think there's a very profound truth here, that who we are out there is who we are in here. And being someone who listens, being someone who practices quietness, is someone who I think can maybe worship in a way that's more pleasing to God, or better understand what it is that we're doing. You know, even early Christians, they actually practiced silence as a spiritual discipline. I mean, some of them took it obviously way too far. You had monks who took vows of silence for decades or things like that. But silence was a spiritual discipline. They saw it as a way of disciplining our spirits, of training in godliness. That just practicing silence was something they could do to better themselves. Right? Just as healthy eating or exercise are things we can do to better ourselves, they saw silence as something we can do to cultivate a better person in who we are. So Solomon here, verses 1 through 3, gives us these two different people who approach God. One is those who offer the sacrifice of fools, that is, those who don't really understand what they're doing, those who just want to get it done and over with and move on. And they're, as Jesus quotes from Isaiah, you know, their lips pronounce God's name, but their heart is far from him. Or you have people who guard their steps and they listen. And like I said, I think listening as a practice in how we worship is, for me, it's new territory. It's something before I was reading this and putting together I just hadn't considered. And yet it is something that Solomon really advises us and gives us great wisdom in teaching us to do. But then Solomon also, in helping us to understand how to be people who listen, especially when we come near God, brings out these instructions to fear God. I mean, that's how he sums it all up in verse 7. For many dreams increase and words grow, many there is vanity, but God is the one you must fear. I want to speak to this for a moment, because fearing God is exactly what it sounds like. And I think it is sometimes watered down when people present it. Sometimes it's presented as if we're saying to show God reverence. And I think that's certainly included, but there is a sense of being afraid, and especially being afraid of what God can do when we cross him and when we sin against him. Being aware of God's power should cause us to be a little frightened of what it means to rub up against God. To fear God is exactly what it sounds like. But I want to be clear, this is not being afraid of God in the sense that God is unapproachable. But what it is having a healthy fear of the power of God when we cross him. I just wanted to make that clear because sometimes it isn't very clear. And like I said, I've heard it watered down a few times, but we don't want to water this down. This is, in a way, being afraid of who God is and what he can do. Should we try to pull the wool over God's eyes? Because that's exactly what's going on here. These people who are offering this foolish sacrifice are people who think they're getting away with something, as if God doesn't see. They think they can, like I said, pull the wool over God's eyes. They can get away with it. They can offer a phony sacrifice and God will believe it. And Solomon says, no, we need to fear God. We can't trick God. We can't mock God. God knows us, and much, much better than that. Solomon here then gives us a couple ways to cultivate the fear of God. First is by considering who we are in light of God, comparing ourselves with God. So in verse 2, he says, "Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven, and you are on earth." As Americans, we don't like social hierarchy very much. We don't buy into it often. But there are places in this world, right? You go to places like the Middle East, you go to parts of Asia, where social hierarchy is very normal. And people understand this is someone who is above me. And this is someone who has the right to tell me what to do. And this is what Solomon is really trying to get across to us. God is in heaven. Right? God is eternal. God is self-existent. I'm not. I can't do that. God can speak and make something from nothing. And I can't do that. I'm frail. I will return to dust. God is in heaven and we are on earth. When we consider who God is and begin to really understand this fear of God should cultivate a listening attitude. There's no coincidence that this comes up here. It should cultivate a kind of quietness from us. In fact, hold your finger here and turn over to Job chapter 40. Job chapter 40. This is after God has appeared to Job. I want you to notice Job's response, starting in verse 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer, twice, but I will proceed no further." You notice that when Job is confronted with God, his response is to guard his words and to listen. That's his response. And this is the same thing that Solomon over in Ecclesiastes 5 is trying to get across. To guard our steps, to listen when we come before God, because God is in heaven and we are on earth. When we fear God, we actually listen to God better. It's when we don't fear God that we just don't listen to him very much. We don't take him very seriously. We think we can get away with things. We think we can trick him and mock him and get away with it. But when we fear God, then in worship we become better listeners. And Solomon says, I think to cultivate this fear, he gives us a couple areas to consider. First is that God is in heaven, we are on earth, to really compare ourselves with God. But then he goes on in verses 4 through 7 to discuss vowing. He says, when you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity, but God is the one you must fear. Now, taking vows was a part of Jewish ceremony in some ways. They were sometimes allowed to do it, but you see even Solomon here saying what Jesus would say later, it's better not to do it than to do it and not do anything. But taking vows had to do with our relationship with God from a Jewish perspective, and to break these vows must be confessed to the priest, which is what we read here in verse 6, where Solomon says, do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake, or the angel. Really, this is a reference to when a person broke a vow, they had to go to a priest and confess what they did. That's who the messenger is. These priests were considered to be the messengers of God. But I want us to realize that those of us who claim the name Christian, we don't escape this. I think it's easy to say, well, that was the Jewish system. They vowed to do something for so many days and they did it. But as Christians, have we not also made vows to God? And weren't we baptized into Christ? Aren't we a part of this new covenant? That's what covenants are. Covenants are these agreements between people and God. As Paul writes, we have been bought with a price. We have pledged ourselves to God. We have vowed ourselves to God. Every Sunday morning when we take the Lord's Supper, we are reminded of Christ's sacrifice. We are reminded of this new covenant. We are reminded of these vows we have indeed made before our Lord and before our God. And so to cultivate a fear of God, it is good not just for Jews in this Jewish system to consider it. It's good for us to remember what I have vowed, that I've given my life to God, that I sold myself into sin and slavery, and that God purchased me back from it. And I agreed to his purchase. I agreed to be reconciled to God. It was an agreement between me and God. It was, in fact, no different than making a vow before God. As Christians, this should cause us to have a healthy fear of God, to keep in mind the things we have promised to him, our lives, our sacrifices, our intentions, our bodies, every aspect of us. It belongs to God, and we have given it to him. And so as we keep these things in mind, we draw near to God in worship, and we guard our steps, and we listen. Because what can you do before the God who knows everything but listen? I can't teach something God he doesn't know. I can't get on one of my platforms. I can't go onto social media or start a YouTube channel and tell God something he doesn't know. What can I do but listen? What ought I to do but to come into his presence and to listen to the voice of my God? Worship is something to take seriously. Worship is serious business. And it's a quality of foolish people to think less of something that is actually serious. And the way we worship really reveals a lot about us, because who we are out there is who we are in here. And Solomon, I think, gives us great wisdom when he teaches us that when we come before God to worship, one thing we should do is to listen to who God is, to hear what he has to say to us, and to fear God for what he can do should we offer a foolish sacrifice. At this time, we always like to offer an invitation. And I invite you, first and foremost, to be someone who listens and who fears God. Because if you listen to God instead of talking back to God, and if you fear God instead of taking him lightly, much of your life will go smoothly. We invite you also at this time to take care of anything that comes between you and God. If there's anything we can do to assist you to get your relationship right with God, whether it's to talk with you, to study with you, to pray for you, to listen to you, if there's anything we can do, we ask that you would talk to us or even make your need known now as we'll stand and sing the invitation song.